Julius Caesar biography, reading 8, his controversial consulship. Caesar's about 41 years old at the time, which to you seems old, but to me, I remember when I was 41, I was pretty brash, and so was Caesar in 59 BC. Remember, Caesar had now formed the first triumvirate, something that was extra legal, not necessarily illegal, but certainly outside of the law, where Caesar formed a very useful relationship with Pompeius Magnus, who started out as Sulla's golden boy of generalship, who had combated very successfully against Sertorius, Spartacus, the pirates, Mithridates, and had great possessions in the east. The only trouble was the land that would be owed to his veterans upon their retirement. The Senate was blocking these legislations because they didn't want Pompey seeming too powerful. Also, the land they would be getting for the veterans would be land that the senators themselves were leasing out for pennies a year to feed their flocks, because this was the ager publicus land which was left over. So therefore, Pompeius was not happy with the Senate. Marcus Crassus is somewhat of a shadowy figure. He was the biggest lender in Rome, with no interest loans to the Senate. The senators needed loans constantly to keep up their financial amounts of money they needed to stay in the Senate. Every 5 years, a census would be run. And if you didn't have that much cash on hand, you were no longer in the senatorial class. So Crassus did give a number of loans, and they were no interest, which is really nice. The only trouble was they could be called in at any moment, which mean that Crassus could pull some very strong political strings throughout the Senate. So this triumvirate with Pompeius Magnus, especially with his armed veterans who were still in the city, who had not received their land, as well as with Marcus Crassus, who owned the purse strings of the senators, gives Caesar a very powerful position in which to rule. Now, the consul is an interesting position. It is your youngest age could be just like the president, 40 years of age. So it's important that Caesar gets his offices at his first suo anno in his own year. It is the final rung of the cursus honorum. Your year is named after you. It's an important time. However, it doesn't do much. You chair Senate meetings alternately with your consular partner. There are two consuls. You introduce laws to the Senate. You basically run the speaking order. Laws get passed by the Senate. Laws get ratified by the popular assembly. And at the end, you go out for a year in the proconsular provinces. It's a very important position, but it's a position that doesn't do much because laws don't get passed quickly, especially when there's 300 members of the Senate to debate. And also, laws, once they get to the assembly, they can be ratified, but oftentimes tribunes will block them. So it is not it's not a position that has a far-reaching scope. You have to go through all the mechanisms of Roman government, which move very slowly. You only had a year of service, and then you got your proconsular province, which you got in charge of, larger province. But that was only for a year as well. The Roman government is designed to focus on least amount of governance. That doesn't work with Caesar's mood. So Caesar is also blocked. Now, he would have the ability to, as a consul, as the patrician consul, he would be able to lecture to the senators and get his legislation hopefully passed. And then the legislation would then go from the Senate to the Citizens' Assembly, or one of the popular assemblies. They could always be blocked at any time by the tribunes of the people. Now, in Caesar, as you'll read, one of the consuls, Bibulus, the tribune, the plebeian consul, wanted to block Caesar. So therefore, he did certain things that would block Caesar from being able to rule jointly, because you had to have both consuls there. And even more than that, Bibulus came up with a stratagem that would make all of Caesar's rules illegal at the end. You also had a fair number of the senators keeping out of the Senate. The Senate can't make laws unless they have a majority body, unless there's a certain amount of quorum. Maybe 200 or so would have to be there. And many senators just stayed home. So without the quorum, Caesar couldn't pass his legislation. So what did he do? He took the unprecedented step of going directly to the plebeian assembly, directly to the citizens' assembly, which not only plebs, but also everyone else. And their vote, they don't deliberate, they just vote yes or no. So that's why you have all of these discussions in the forums and this high drama with Cato, because Caesar is attempting to get his legislation passed. Well, what's his legislation? First legislation was to require all debates in the Senate to be recorded and then posted in the forum. This is important since Caesar is playing to his popular base. But also important, as we'll be seeing when we look at Caesar in Gaul. And then he is to introduce an agrarian bill to break up those public lands the senators were getting a hold of, to pasture their sheep, and redistribute this to Italy, to Pompey's soldiers and the homeless poor in Rome. So very similar to the tribunes of the people, the Gracchi. This is the big part of what Caesar wanted to get done, which the Senate blocked. There's also a problem because you have Cicero, the great speaker of the Senate, who was able to get a lot of stuff done. But the trouble is that Cicero did not really support Caesar and the triumvirate's plan. Cicero was very much a everybody getting together kind of guy and not a direct power down discussion. But enter in Clodius, a patrician family. However, Clodius had a real grudge against Cicero because Cicero had insinuated that he had performed incest with his sister Claudia and that Claudia had murdered her own husband. So Claudius hated Cicero. And additionally, Claudius, we saw in the Bona Dea scandal a few chapters ago, was quite the reckless enthusiast. But he was also a demagogue and a rabble-rouser who Caesar knew that he could make use of, because if he could just transfer him from the patrician family, get him adopted by a plebeian, which he did at 9 o'clock at night, really late. No legislation could be done at night. But he was, as a position of Pontifex Maximus, he was able to transfer Claudius into the Clodian clan, tribune of the people. And therefore, because he's a demagogue and rabble-rouser, he ran for tribune of the people, got appointed really quickly within Caesar's year, which is rather unusual how that happened. And then Clodius was able to get Cicero exiled and even had his house burned down. So as a result, Cicero is now no longer going to be part of the opposition that Caesar has to face as consul. And the interesting part is, I think this is where the historical record is wrong, because, of course, Suetonius and Plutarch are writing centuries afterward. I don't believe that this position as tribune of the people could have been done in the middle of Caesar's consulship. It had to have been done beforehand, because they didn't have special elections, and there was no reference to a special election. So anyway, with this action, Caesar proves that he is just as capable to do some political fighting as his opponents. Well, that takes care of Caesar's controversial consulship, probably one of the more controversial that they had remembered without open war. And it sets him up for his unprecedented proconsulship of Gaul.